They thought she would break the moment the noise started.
They thought pain had to be physical, that a human mind couldn't endure pure sound when pushed to its limits. But they hadn't studied her, not the way the right people had.
They didn't know that silence to her was a luxury long buried in war. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The chamber was small, windowless, and clinically white, with no visible source of light. It felt like standing inside a dead star, lit but lifeless. In the center sat a single chair, bolted to the floor, its steel arms spread wide like a crucifix. Leather straps hung loose for now, waiting for a reason. Mounted on the ceiling above the chair were 4 speaker cones, military-grade, directional, and hidden behind mesh, so fine it looked like part of the architecture. The room wasn't made for conversation, it was designed to unravel identity. She sat on the edge of the chair, wrists resting in her lap, ankles crossed calmly, no shoes, no coat. Her clothes were institutional gray, unbranded, unstained. Her hair, once auburn, was tied back, revealing the curve of her jaw, and the cut on her temple, which had dried to a thin line of rust-colored blood. No name tag, no file beside her, not even a number. She had been here for 4 days, though no clock confirmed it. Just a sense her body carried: tightened muscles, parched mouth, the ache behind her eyes, like a rising tide of pressure. Then it began. Not a bang, not a scream, but a low, pulsing hum, a sound like jet engines miles away but crawling toward you at bone level. It passed through her ears, not into them, resonating through her spine, filling the hollow spaces inside her with vibration. Her teeth tingled. Her lungs felt squeezed. The noise grew, layer upon layer, climbing in pitch and aggression. It didn't matter where you looked, the sound was everywhere. That was the point. Directionlessness made it worse. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Most people started weeping after 15 minutes. She closed her eyes and began counting. Back in a compound buried beneath the earth in a war-torn region that didn't exist on maps, she had been trained for this. Not in a classroom, not by lectures, but by isolation. They locked them into chambers with audio on full, white noise, static, screams, drills. One girl went blind for 2 days, even though her eyes were open. Another broke her own wrist trying to climb the walls. But this woman, before she was captured, she learned something. Sound is a shape, and if you can give it a pattern, you can turn it into rhythm, and rhythm is control. So she counted in her head, seconds, not minutes. Minutes were too long. Breaths, not words. Because breath, unlike words, is under your full command. The door behind her opened. She didn't turn. Boots on tile, 2 steps, pause, another step, someone tall, someone trained, the scent of disinfectant and coffee, a blend she recognized from military detention. Male, American, but not native, probably raised overseas. She opened her eyes as the boots stopped beside her. "You have a name?" he asked. She didn't speak. "You'll want to start talking. This noise, it doesn't stop, ever, not until we're done." She turned her head slightly and looked at him, not defiant, not afraid, just watching. "I don't need you to give up state secrets," he added, crouching to her eye level. "I just need to know why you were at the embassy when the bombs went off. Why your prints match nothing in any database. Why you've had reconstructive surgery on both hands." She looked back at the speakers. The man sighed. "Suit yourself." He stood and walked out. The noise escalated again. It became a scream, but not from a human throat. It was industrial, mechanical, wounding. She didn't flinch. By the 6th hour, the walls seemed to breathe. Not really, but the way sound pulsed, it made even fixed things feel alive. She had long since stopped looking at the room. Her mind was walking slowly to a memory she had stored for this very situation. A classroom underground. A man with a voice like snow, soft, cold, measured. His hands tracing diagrams on chalk walls, lines showing how to partition memory, isolate trauma, and delay panic. He never smiled. He taught them the art of the silence, inside chaos. And when she felt her mind start to fray, not crack, but vibrate too hard, she went to that silence. The place in her head she had built for years, a clean white room with no doors, and inside it, a chair she was never strapped to. Noise can't kill you, but fear of losing yourself to it can. She didn't fear that. The door opened again. This time, two men walked in. One of them wasn't dressed like the others. No badge, no uniform. He carried a small tuning fork in one hand and looked at her like a scientist examining a rare animal. "She's not reacting at all," he asked. "Not to pain, not to tone shifts, no emotion. It's like she was expecting this." The man with the tuning fork narrowed his eyes. "I've seen this before," he murmured. "This one, she's not here by accident." And in that moment, as the sound continued screaming through her skull, she smiled. They had just made their first mistake. The room she was moved to had no sound, none at all. Not the hum of lights, not the whir of air circulation, not even the rustle of clothes. It was silence by design. A vacuum of sense. She sat across from a mirror that reflected nothing but her stillness, flanked by two blank walls and a single surveillance camera that blinked red every 10 seconds like a heartbeat. They thought they were changing tactics. They thought depriving her senses would unmoor her faster than noise ever could. They didn't realize they were stepping into her domain. Her captors weren't low-level military thugs anymore. The switch in environment told her that much. They were frightened, or at least suspicious. They'd expected another panicked prisoner with just enough knowledge to matter and just enough fragility to crumble. But now they were reconsidering what they had. She could see it in the way the guards no longer looked directly at her, how their routines became erratic, more button presses, more whispered updates. They were starting to ask the right questions, but not out loud, because the right questions were dangerous, even to themselves. She had no file, no passport, no national identity chip. Nothing on her face or fingerprints matched any known registry. Her blood work showed no drugs, no implants, no signs of malnutrition, despite being in captivity for nearly a week. Her neural response scans, though, those had alarmed them. Brainwave activity in the frontal cortex remained unusually stable, even under duress. Her pain reflexes were intact, but her emotional centers didn't spike the way they should have. It wasn't sociopathy, it wasn't trauma. It was discipline. And that made her valuable, or lethal. He entered without knocking, the man from before, not the interrogator, with military boots and barked orders, but the civilian, the one with the tuning fork, and the two quiet presents. He didn't sit right away. He circled, like a hawk gauging the wind. She could feel him cataloging her, posture, breath rate, micro-movements. His eyes weren't searching for guilt, they were scanning for programming. "You weren't born into this," he said finally. His voice was soft, deliberate. "Someone built you." She didn't respond. "And if they built you, it means they buried you too, off-grid, deep." He leaned in slightly. "There's only one place I know that trains people to withstand the kind of interrogation we put you through, and it was supposedly shut down 8 years ago after a mutiny. It was called Grey Wake." At that word her breathing paused, not from fear, but from calculation. He smiled when he saw it. "So it still exists." She blinked once, slowly. "I know you're not going to speak," he continued, "but I don't need your voice. I just need your silence to match what I already know." He placed the tuning fork on the table. It rang once, soft and resonant, barely a whisper in the dead silence. But to her it was deafening. Not because of volume, but because of memory. Greywake had used tuning forks in the earliest phase of their training to calibrate emotional suppression. Certain frequencies, played at low volume, could link a subject's cognitive function with trigger memories, then overwrite them. For most, the results were uneven. For her they were flawless. The sound he'd just played was one her instructor had used during the trial phase of memory dissociation. The fact that this man knew it told her something chilling. He wasn't just an interrogator, he was a defector. "You trained under Masaryk, didn't you?" he asked, watching her closely. That name hit like a ghost. Masaryk hadn't been just a handler, he had been the architect of Greywake's mental warfare curriculum. The man who taught her to catalog pain like data, and assign it no value. The man who disappeared the year everything collapsed. "You were one of the last batch before the rebellion," the man continued. "They called you Belladonna, right? The one who didn't need chemicals to compartmentalize. The one who passed the echo test in under 4 minutes. Still she said nothing. But her gaze held steady. He lowered his voice. You don't need to tell me why you were at the embassy. I already know. You weren't targeting anyone. You were protecting something, or someone. He sat back, and you weren't captured. You allowed yourself to be taken. Finally, she moved. She reached forward, and touched the table lightly, then tapped her finger once, twice, 3 times. Pause. 1. Pause. 2. A slow pattern. His eyes widened. That's not a response code, he said, confused. That's a sequence, a pre-trigger. Wait. But before he could finish, the door slammed open. Another soldier stormed in, face pale, holding a tablet in one shaking hand. Sir, he said to the civilian. The cameras, we lost feeds on levels B through D, all of them, just static. The man frowned. What kind of static? The soldier showed him the screen. It was a wall of shifting visual noise, but she knew better. She recognized the pattern, white noise encryption. Somewhere inside this facility, something or someone was activating. She leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes, and breathed in. This wasn't an interrogation anymore. It was a countdown. The static on the tablet screen wasn't accidental. It wasn't a glitch or a camera failure. It was intentional, precise, rhythmic, encoded. Anyone else would have seen meaningless visual fuzz. But she had been taught to see the shape inside the chaos, and that shape had a purpose. It was a countdown, yes, but not to an explosion, not to a rescue. It was the return of memory, a sound-based key unlocking the training she had locked away so deeply that even she no longer knew where it began. The man with the tuning fork, his name was Galen, she'd finally remembered, stared at the tablet with silent dread. He knew what it meant though, perhaps not entirely. He had defected from the Greywake program, yes, but he had never graduated from it. He had seen what the full conditioning could do to a mind. He'd seen agents walk through walls of fire, laugh under torture, erase people with a pencil. But what he hadn't seen, what no one had, was what would happen when one of them went dormant and then reactivated. It wasn't supposed to be possible. The echo tests were supposed to wear off. Belladonna had disproved that now. Her fingers twitched once on the table. She wasn't controlling them. The muscle memory was. 2 taps, pause, 4. Then 1 long press. It wasn't Morse code. It was rhythm sequencing, sonic muscle signaling, a silent command, a buried response. Somewhere in the facility, another receiver might be listening. Galen stepped backward, eyes narrowing. She's not trying to escape, he said softly. She's sinking. What does that mean? Barked the soldier still at the door, but Galen didn't answer. He was already calculating the range of the signal, the possible nodes in the surveillance system that could serve as a relay. It was brilliant, really. Noise to disarm the mind, static to mask the signal. She'd been transmitting without words, without movement, using nothing but memory and biological rhythm. She was the encryption, her body, her breath, her recall. Every piece of her was part of the code. Inside the chamber, the walls began to shift tone again, not visibly, sonically. A subtle hum built beneath the silence, so low it wasn't heard, it was felt. A sub-bass frequency between 18 and 20 hertz, just on the edge of human perception. It resonated in the bones. The guards felt dizzy. The lights flickered once, then again. They didn't understand what was happening, but she did. This frequency wasn't part of the interrogation setup. It was part of the facility's failsafe, a signal designed to short-circuit all analog systems in the event of a full breach. The last time she had felt it was during the collapse of Greywake. It meant the system was responding, not to an external threat, but to her. It had recognized her imprint. She stood. No one had given her permission to move, but no one stopped her either. Even the soldier at the door didn't lift his weapon. There was something unnatural in the way she moved now, fluid, predatory, deliberate. Not a victim, not a captive, an agent waking from deep sleep. Galen stepped between her and the door. You've already triggered the protocol, he said. You can't stop it now. I'm not trying to stop it, she said. Her voice was soft, dry from disuse, but even in 2 words it carried a weight that pressed into the room like gravity. The guards flinched. It was the first time she'd spoken since her capture. "What are you trying to do?" he asked. "I'm remembering." That was when the alarm started. Short bursts, 3 per sequence, then a pause. Red lights flickered in time with the sirens, casting shadows in sharp relief. The chamber's ceiling opened slightly, and a panel of unknown purpose began to descend. "I was there," she whispered, eyes fixed on the descending panel. "The day the sanctuary fell, they made us choose, escape, or forget. You chose both," Jelen said, stunned. "You let them bury your training." She nodded once. "But they forgot the key can find its lock." The panel hit the floor with a metallic clunk. Inside wasn't a weapon, but a black case the size of a book. She walked toward it and knelt. Her fingers slid over the surface and pressed 4 points. The lock disengaged. Inside, cushioned in black foam, lay a headset, sleek, metallic, old, a relic from her early missions. A sound interface with one purpose: overwrite command centers with embedded frequencies. She turned to Gelen. "This place isn't what you think it is." He raised an eyebrow. "You're not here for revenge." "No. I'm here to finish the message Greywake started." He swallowed hard. "They'll kill you before you reach the core." "I know. But you'll go anyway." She smiled. "They tortured me with noise because they thought sound could break me. But they never learned the first rule. Which is..." She placed the headset over her ears and activated the signal. "Sound," she said, "is only deadly if you don't know how to listen." And with that, the floor vibrated beneath them, just once, and everything changed. The tremor was brief, barely a second, but it told her everything. The facility was deeper than it appeared. The floor beneath the interrogation rooms wasn't solid concrete. It was suspended, insulated, layered with acoustic insulation built to contain experimental frequencies. That kind of architecture didn't exist in a standard military black site. It existed in only one kind of structure, an echo chamber. Not for sound, but for minds. Her training snapped fully into place now. Memories that had been dampened, blurred and sealed returned like floodwaters behind a broken dam. She remembered the maze-like halls of Greywake, the way instructors whispered, instead of shouted, the daily drills that required silence, while under sonic stress. She remembered the reversal rooms, where the loudest torture wasn't sound but silence. But above all, she remembered the phrase they etched into the walls of every corridor: "Noise reveals the listener." It was never about resistance, it was about calibration. Now she calibrated. As she stepped out of the interrogation chamber, headset in place, her eyes adjusted to the dim emergency lighting. No one stopped her. No one dared. Even the surveillance cameras tilted slightly, as if averting their mechanical gaze. Every few feet, she could feel slight vibrations in the walls, pulses of subsonic rhythm. A signal, not random, but directed. It wasn't the failsafe anymore. This was something more. Behind her, Jelen followed with slow, uncertain steps. His face was pale. "This is bigger than I thought." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. She was already processing the next corridor, its angle, its soundscape, the way the frequencies shifted every few meters, like layers of a test. Whoever had built this place had kept the skeleton of Greywake, but twisted it into something darker, more desperate. It wasn't a training ground. It was a filter. Someone, was selecting those who could survive sound, and eliminating the rest. They passed a room where a guard sat slumped in his chair, ears bleeding, mouth open in a silent scream. The lights in that room flickered with a stutter that mirrored the last frequency she had heard. He wasn't dead, but his mind might never return. She didn't stop. She couldn't. Up ahead, the hallway branched. To the left, the main command center. To the right, a long hallway marked restricted, Tier 5 clearance only. That was the path she chose. Jelen didn't follow this time. "You won't make it in there," he warned. That section was sealed, after the last incident. She turned slightly toward him, eyes calm. "That's why I need to be there." With a hiss, the door unlocked at her presence. No code, no fingerprint. The room remembered her. Inside, the sound was different. It wasn't painful. It was layered with voices, thousands of them. Not speaking, not yelling, but whispering. All at once. The room was playing a memory field, stored fragments of former detainees, extracted during auditory interrogation. It was a prison of echoes, But for her, it was a library. She stepped into the center and placed her hand on the interface. A pulse read her biosignature. The walls shimmered with audio holograms, ghosts of broken minds replaying their final thoughts before silence. But one voice caught her attention. Belladonna, her name, spoken from somewhere in the far corner of the room. She turned slowly. A man stood there, older, thinner, wearing the uniform of a senior technician. His eyes were bloodshot, but lucid. He hadn't been a prisoner. He had been waiting. "You came back," he said, as if she'd left only yesterday. She stared at him. "Dr. Colt." He nodded once. "I'm the last one left. They used our research, twisted it. I stayed behind to bury the original sequence. I wasn't sure it would ever reach you." "It did," she said quietly. He stepped forward, trembling. "They don't know what's beneath this chamber. The original memory vault, it's still intact, but it's sealed by resonance lock." She knew what he meant. A resonance lock required a very specific frequency, one that could only be replicated by the original test subject who produced it. "Why hide it?" she asked. "Because inside that vault," he whispered, "is the protocol that made you." She hesitated. "Then I'm not here to destroy it." He looked surprised. "I'm here to finish it." Above them the lights began to pulse, faster, urgently. The facility had realized she was no longer a prisoner. She was an operator. Suddenly alarms flared, real ones this time. Soldiers began flooding the halls. Jelen's voice crackled through a nearby intercom. "They know you're active. They're rerouting the auditory pressure system to the vault. They're going to collapse it before you get there." Dr. Colt's hands shook. "You won't survive that frequency blast." She looked at the corridor ahead. "I've survived worse." And without another word, she ran toward the vault, through sound, through fear, through everything they thought would break her. Because they were right about one thing. She didn't have a name, but she had a purpose. The fourth day without sleep broke something in the average person. But Noah wasn't average. She had been trained in environments designed to mimic collapse. Chambers where blinding strobe lights and screaming alarms were piped in for 72 hours straight. But even so, nothing had prepared her for the silence between the noise. It was like her captors had studied her personal rhythms, each crescendo of sound now followed by dead air. So suffocating, it made her wonder if her heart had stopped beating. They weren't just trying to extract information anymore. They were testing the limits of the human mind, and they were getting close. Each cycle of noise stripped away a part of her sensory tether. She could no longer tell if her limbs were still bound, or if her body had simply given up on movement. Her ears bled from the inside, and every sound, every low frequency began to take shape in the form of hallucinations. Voices of old enemies, laughter from people she had buried, and one particular name. "Navarra," the voice kept whispering. Over and over again. Noah didn't know what the name meant, but it slipped through the noise like a needle. It didn't belong to her, which meant someone else was inside the system. She filed it away in the folds of her mind, storing it between other fragments of clarity, like "you're not hallucinating," and they're cycling specific data. She noticed how certain sounds repeated every 13 hours, how some interrogation agents wore the same boots but used different accents. They wanted her to think her grip on time was slipping, but she had started counting again. Breaths between tones, steps between interrogators, pauses between the power cycling off and back on. Even when the pain made her vomit, she counted. She had found a rhythm, and rhythm meant control. When they brought her out of the chamber for a second time, Noah's body collapsed before she could step. They thought it was a sign she was weakening, but it wasn't. It was an act, one she'd rehearsed in Aegis Unit 5 during Black Site counter-training. Feign deterioration. Let them loosen the straps. Let them touch you, and when they do, snap. But she didn't. Not yet. Because she saw something new in their eyes that day. Worry. The kind that only comes when a subject doesn't break on schedule. They knew the clock was running out, and so did she. The noise would return soon. But this time, she wouldn't just endure it. She'd use it. The corridor leading to the next chamber felt like a descent into something ancient and wrong. The walls, padded with acoustic foam, seemed to absorb not just sound, but breath, thought, memory. Each step Mira took was like walking deeper into a frequency where the air itself hummed with unseen danger. Her ears, trained for dissonance, now felt the weight of absolute silence, a silence that screamed louder than any shriek she had endured in the previous room. Her guards didn't speak. They moved in tight formation, their boots muffled, their faces like closed doors. She counted her steps, trained herself to slow her pulse. The last thing she could afford now was to fall into the spiral of trauma memory. One door opened, then another. And finally, she was ushered into a perfectly square room where a single chair waited. No speakers, no wires, just padded walls and sterile white light from above. She knew this setup. It was an inversion chamber. Not designed to inflict sound, but to eliminate it. Complete anechoic isolation, the room would drive most people to the edge in 20 minutes. It would whisper to their fears, magnify the sound of their blood, their heartbeat, their own breath, until it felt like drowning in themselves. Mira knew because she had built something similar for the agency's counter-resistance division. But being prepared and being immune were not the same. They left her there, alone, no countdown, no warning. Just the slow closing of the door, the seal of silence, and the total abandonment of external reference. At first, Mira sat, hands on thighs, back straight, breathing shallow. She tried to tap into her training, recite coordinates of missions, maps, classified intel, but the silence mocked her. It bent around her ears, it made the cartilage tremble. Within minutes she could hear her own blood moving. The saliva in her throat was too loud. The creak of a tendon in her neck was unbearable. She felt the beginning of auditory hallucinations, not from sound, but from the absence of it. Her body, desperate for input, began fabricating ghosts, voices from the past. Her brother's laughter, the shriek of her mother's final scream, her handler whispering across an encrypted channel, "Never break in silence. They'll think they've won." Mira clenched her fists. She refused to scream, but her body began reacting anyway. Sweat trickled down her back in long, erratic trails. Her pupils dilated. Her fingers spasmed. The room wasn't killing her with pain, it was killing her with herself, and that, she realized, was the point. This wasn't torture in the traditional sense, it was erosion. They were waiting for her identity to dissolve, for her to collapse into a puddle of need, for noise, for touch, for anything that reminded her she was real. Time lost meaning. She tried to count seconds, then heartbeats, then memories. But everything looped, images overlapped, sound became vision, vision became fear. She pressed her head against the wall, still nothing, still silence, and then came the first real hallucination, a door slamming. A voice, "It's over." Mira knew it wasn't real, but she stood. Every cell in her body screamed for interaction. She pounded the wall, screamed, but no sound came from outside. That too was the trap. Make her perform for an audience that wasn't there. It was elegant, psychological warfare wrapped in minimalist design. But Mira had one advantage they didn't expect. She had been silenced before. In a cell much like this years ago when the agency tested her threshold during final clearance. Back then, she had cracked after 23 hours. But this was different. She wasn't a recruit anymore. She wasn't untested. She wasn't alone in her mind. She dropped to the floor, laid flat, closed her eyes, and did what she had once been trained never to do. Surrender to the noise inside. She began listening, not resisting, and in that surrender, she found patterns, breathing syncopations, muscle twitches like Morse code. Her nervous system was talking to her, not betraying her. Hours passed, maybe days. Her hair matted with sweat, her lips cracked, but she did not break. Eventually, the door hissed open again, light spilled in. Her pupils burned. She didn't flinch, she didn't move, she just whispered, 12 hertz. You used it before sealing the chamber. That's why I adjusted my vestibular baseline. The technician froze. The two guards looked at each other. Mira stood barely and stared into their shock. You thought silence would break me. Silence trained me. They didn't reply, but one of them, an older officer, nodded, just slightly. A recognition of sorts. It was the first moment Mira realized something strange. Not everyone here wanted her broken. Some wanted to see what she could survive, and perhaps what she might eventually destroy. Noah had been trained to hear patterns in chaos, but this was something else. The hum that came at 3:21 a.m. wasn't like the others. It didn't shriek. It didn't claw at her sanity with blunt force. It spoke a low-frequency pattern, thudding softly through the floor like the heartbeat of some buried creature. She froze on the concrete, ear pressed to the cold surface. She wasn't reacting out of pain anymore. She was listening. 4 pulses. Pause. 3 pulses. Longer pause. Then 5. Her mind scrambled to make sense of it. It wasn't in English, but the rhythm wasn't random. It had structure. Morse code. No. Something older. Encrypted but not to confuse her. To reach her. She sifted through her memory, past the pain, the dizziness, the white noise that lived behind her eyes now, and then it clicked. Not Morse. Echo rot. A dead protocol. Obsolete since the West Bank coup. She hadn't used it since her first operation, back when she was still learning how to bend trauma into tactics. But now, decades later, someone else had resurrected it. Not by accident. Still alive. Hold. The message repeated. Noah's mouth went dry. Somewhere outside these walls, beyond the static and the deafness and the fear, someone still knew she existed. Someone was trying to reach her, and that someone was close. Close enough to send vibrations through concrete and metal. Close enough to risk a breach. And if someone was coming, she had to stay alive long enough for them to find her. She shifted, just barely, curling her body toward the center of the room like a creature in hibernation. Every muscle burned. Her skin still screamed from contact with the acoustic feedback wall. Her eardrums were red raw, her balance nearly destroyed. But her mind, that was awake now. The auditory patterns kept pulsing, but they changed again, subtly. The thuds began bouncing in tighter rhythms, giving her something new shape. They were mapping the walls, not visually, sonically. She realized with a jolt, the team outside wasn't just trying to communicate. They were feeding her a layout. Each pressure shift, each frequency drift, told her something about thickness, resonance, density. She had been blind in here for days. Now she could see. And when you can see, you can plan. So she began playing her role, slowing her breathing, letting her body slump with believable fatigue, staring into nothing whenever the guards checked in. Let them think she was cracking. Let them believe their noise was still breaking her. She wouldn't fight them out loud anymore. She would fight them quietly. And that's when she noticed her second advantage. The guard they called Red, a tall woman with sunken cheeks and a limp in her right leg, always carried her access card sloppily. Too close to the edge of her hip, too exposed. Noah started timing her walks. 15 paces from the door to the panel. 7 seconds spent checking the restraints. 4 seconds to scan the vital screen. Then the same exit path, every single time. Routine, boredom, a crack in the system. But just as she began crafting her next move, the torturers changed the game. On the 5th day they wheeled in something new. It looked like a medical rig. It wasn't. It was a neural lacerator. Rumors of them had circulated for years, off-grid sci-tech, designed not just to torture but to overwrite. It implanted auditory hallucinations directly into the brainstem. Voices, sounds, memories that weren't hers, surgically inserted like viruses into the neural lattice. It could make a person believe they were drowning, make them hear their dead parents whispering, make them forget their own name. Noah stared at the machine as they strapped her down. Most prisoners would have wept. Most would have screamed. Noah smiled, because she recognized the tech. It had a flaw. She'd seen the schematics years ago, back when she still believed in redacted blueprints and clean kills. She knew how to break it from the inside. And more than that, if she could get her hands on the internal coil, she could reverse the output signal, turn it from weapon to beacon. The guards leaned over her, adjusting knobs and calibrating the auditory stimuli with glee. They thought they were about to crack her soul open like a rotten egg. But Noah had already slipped into her zone. She wasn't listening to them anymore. She was listening to the vibrations in the floor. Echo rot had gone quiet, but not completely. One last message pushed through the concrete beneath her spine. 2 walls breached. 32 seconds to convergence. Her lips curled. They were already inside. And if she played this next moment right, her captors wouldn't just lose a prisoner. They'd lose the entire facility. The lights flickered. The floor shivered. It wasn't the lacerator activating. It was external impact. She could hear it now. Soft, rhythmic metallic percussion along the hallways, like distant boots, and a low mechanical growl beneath. The breach team wasn't coming. They were here. Her breath steadied. Her heart slowed. The guards were shouting now, confused. She closed her eyes and began counting backward from 10, not for calm but for timing. At 0, she'd act, not to escape, but to ignite. Because sometimes survival wasn't about crawling out. It was about turning the chamber into a weapon, and she was ready. The next tactic was architectural, subtle, psychological. They moved her to a room without corners, where the walls curved into the floor and ceiling like the inside of an egg. There was no place for shadows to gather, no sense of orientation. Every surface reflected a muted, oppressive white, and the lighting had no discernible source. This was not about noise, cold or light anymore. This was about space, how it distorts time, how it disassembles sanity when it offers no frame of reference. The door vanished into the wall the moment it closed. There were no handles, no seams, just endless, nauseating white. Navarro sat in the middle of it all, her posture unbending. At first she tried to calculate how much time had passed by the sound of her own breathing, but even that became unreliable in a place where echoes behaved strangely. Her training had included simulations of spatial disorientation, but nothing as complete as this. And still she adjusted. She closed her eyes and mapped her body instead. Her breath, her pulse, the tension in her legs, these became her constants. They wanted her to feel lost, but they forgot that she'd been born in chaos, raised in it. She didn't fear disorientation. She had learned to find direction internally. Colonel Brecht observed from a hidden panel behind the seamless wall. This was his favorite experiment, a design he'd stolen from sensory deprivation tanks used in cognitive warfare research. He believed it stripped a subject of their identity. Most couldn't last more than 2 days. By day 3, Navarro still hadn't spoken. Her vitals remained steady, her posture unchanged. She hadn't scratched herself, screamed or curled into fetal despair. Instead she'd begun to hum, soft, low, a melody that felt ancient. It unsettled the staff more than silence. "What's she doing?" one technician asked. Brecht didn't answer. He was watching her lips move now. She wasn't just humming anymore. She was repeating something. A phrase. A chant. A language he didn't recognize. He called for the linguist. "It's not a language," the linguist later reported. "It's code." The phrase Navarro repeated was rhythmically aligned with SEER protocols. Survival, evasion, resistance, escape. Each syllable a trigger for mental resilience. Each pause a micro-meditation. She wasn't just surviving the space, she was transforming it. When they tried to interrupt her, the light shifted. They thought the white would disorient her more. Instead she closed her eyes, and returned to darkness by choice. When they piped in low-frequency hums designed to induce nausea, she adjusted her breathing to counteract the effect. The more they tried, the less they understood. Navarro was no longer reacting to the room. She had become the room's master. Her stillness was not surrender, it was strategy. Eventually, Brecht entered. He was tired of observing. "Who trained you?" he asked, leaning close. Navarro looked up, blinking slowly. "You think this is the first egg I've cracked from the inside," she replied, her voice dry and hoarse but steady. Brecht slammed his hand against the curved wall, furious at her composure. "You think you can resist forever?" he growled. "No," she said simply, "just longer than you can comprehend." It was then that he noticed something unnerving. The curves in the room, The perfectly designed disorientation no longer affected her. She was centered, composed, and worse, he felt slightly off balance himself. The very room he had used to break others was turning against him. Her presence infected the geometry, gave it shape. It was no longer sterile, it was her ground now. On day 4, the walls started to sweat. A malfunction in the environmental controls, the technician said. But Navarro knew better. Pressure had a way of pushing things to the surface, not just sweat, but fear. And Brecht was sweating too. He paced outside the observation panel, watching a woman he could not crack, in a room designed to erase identity, who instead carved a sanctuary from nothing. By day 5, Navarro finally took action. She stood slowly, and walked to the center of the room. The ceiling, though seamless, had a flaw, a hairline ripple. Only she had noticed. She raised one arm and pressed her fingers to it. Nothing happened, but she stayed there, one hand against the flaw, eyes closed, whispering the same chant from before. When the camera feed flickered for 3 seconds, no one could explain it. The footage corrupted. The white noise in the tech lab spiked. Navarro had found her exit, not physically, but mentally. She had broken the system not by escaping it, but by adapting to it, so fully it lost its power. Later, when the guards came to retrieve her, she didn't resist. She walked calmly past Brecht, who stood stiffly at the threshold. "You built that room to erase people," she murmured as she passed. "But some of us don't get erased, we get rewritten." He didn't speak. He couldn't. The silence that followed her departure was the loudest the room had ever been. The next phase came quietly. No shouting guards, no slamming doors, just a sterile silence and the hum of fluorescent lights. Navarro was wheeled into a smaller room now, clinical, windowless, almost intimate in its calculated sterility. Her restraints were changed to soft medical straps. No more chains, no more cold steel against her wrists. Just padded cuffs, and a low upholstered chair. A woman entered. Not a soldier, not an interrogator, a civilian. Mid-50s, calm graying hair tied back. She wore no badge, only a clipboard, and the kind of warm smile that sent Navarro's alarms blaring. "Captain Navarro," the woman said softly. "I'm Dr. Ilse Meinhardt. I'm here to talk." Talk. That word had been weaponized before. Navarro knew it too well. The whisper protocol wasn't about pain, it was about erosion. No beatings, no tanks, just sustained psychological disarmament. It was often used after the body had been pushed past physical thresholds, when resistance became a matter of memory more than muscle. The goal was simple: convince the subject that reality had shifted, that what they believed was untrue, that their loyalties had been misplaced. The method had broken warlords, spies, even decorated generals. But Navarro was not any of those things. She was something else entirely, and they hadn't catalogued her kind. Dr. Meinhardt sat across from her, a respectful distance away. No clipboard now, just a glass of water and a box of tissues, like they were in some grief counselor's office. "Do you know why you're here?" she asked. Navarro didn't speak. Not because she lacked words, but because words in this place had power, and she refused to give any of hers away. "Your team left you," Meinhardt continued. "Command blacklisted you. The operation was sealed, your files redacted. Officially, you don't exist anymore. No rank, no country, just silence." Navarro breathed through her nose, slow and deliberate. This was where they would begin bending the truth, mixing it with real fragments to make the lie taste familiar. "They say silence is the last thing we hear before the end," Meinhardt said, her tone gentle. "But I don't believe that. I think it's the first thing we hear before clarity." She leaned in. "Tell me, when did you realize you were expendable?" Navarro didn't blink. The question was meant to slice beneath armor, not pierce it. It relied on festering doubts, on years of unspoken trauma. But Navarro had long since turned her wounds into warnings. If anything, Meinhardt was confirming what she already knew. Command had buried her. But they'd made a mistake thinking that abandonment was equivalent to defeat. The sessions continued for days. Always the same room. Always the same quiet voice. They brought in music from her childhood. Letters from her dead father's archives. Photos of her former squad mates. Each item curated to soften her. Personal relics weaponized as emotional battering rams. But for every tactic they used, Navarro countered in silence. She would not scream. She would not cry. She would not confess. The more gently they pushed, the more still she became. Dr. Meinhardt shifted her approach. "You were supposed to be a mother," she said one day. "I read the reports. The way you cared for the refugee children in Sector 9. You held them like they were your own." This struck deeper than the others. Navarro didn't show it, but her stomach clenched. The children. Her failure to protect them. Their faces still surfaced in her dreams, coated in ash and fear. "Why didn't you stay with them?" Meinhardt pressed. "Why did you choose war?" The question echoed. Because Navarro had never been asked that by someone who wasn't trying to manipulate her. The truth, she didn't choose war. War chose the world around her, and she adapted. She became what the innocent needed. A shield, a warning, a storm. The real question was, why did they think reminding her of pain would weaken her? Pain had sculpted her. It had taught her which voices to ignore, which ones to follow, and how to recognize the difference between illusion and intent. On the 12th day, Meinhardt placed a folder on the table. Inside, Navarro could already guess what lay there. Orders, promises, amnesty. The classic script. "Confess," Meinhardt said. "We'll let you go." A new name. A life far from this place. Navarro finally looked up. Her voice, hoarse from disuse, cracked slightly, as she said her first words in over a week. "You still think I'm trapped here?" Meinhardt blinked. "Aren't you?" Navarro's smile was slow, almost pitying. "No," she said. "You are." And that was the day Meinhardt left without another word. The session stopped. The whisper protocol had failed. What Navarro hadn't told them was that in her world, silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. The room was cleaner than the last one. No chains on the walls, no stink of mildew, no bloodstains disguised as rust. It almost felt like an office, except for the camera embedded in the corner, and the one-way mirror that reflected nothing but dread. Commander Navarro sat across from a man she hadn't seen before, and yet, he looked oddly familiar. Not in face, but in bearing. He was precise. That was the word for him. Everything from the way he folded his hands to the way his jacket sat on his shoulders screamed control. But control was only useful if you knew what you were holding. And Navarro wasn't about to let anyone think they held her. Not this man. Not now. He introduced himself as Dr. Caleb Ryan. His voice was soft, almost apologetic, as if he regretted their meeting under such circumstances. He didn't ask questions at first. He offered her tea, chamomile. "Good for calming the nerves," he said. Navarro didn't respond. Not with words. Her silence was the stone wall that had outlasted 9 days of psychological assault. Ryan watched her for a long time, then took a sip from his own cup. The steam curled like smoke from a battlefield, harmless on the surface, toxic underneath. "I read your file," he said finally. "But they always leave things out, don't they?" He glanced at the mirror, especially when the truth makes them uncomfortable. Navarro's expression didn't shift, but her breath did. Slightly slower, measuring, calculating. He noticed. "You don't remember me, but we've crossed paths before," Ryan said, setting his cup down with a quiet click. "Not directly, but I was part of the same program. Project Hesperus." That name cracked something inside her, not visibly, but enough to rattle the scaffolding she had built in her mind to survive this place. Project Hesperus had been scrubbed from every military archive years ago. It was where they trained operatives in psychological warfare, in deep resilience, in anti-interrogation tactics, so advanced, most people didn't believe the program had ever existed. It was blacker than Black Ops, and it was where Navarro had been reborn, her old self shredded, rewired,
made into something they hadn't even known how to name. They called her null, a designation, not a rank, a ghost with no identity. She had buried it long ago, but now the past was speaking through the mouth of a stranger. Ryan leaned forward. They're not trying to extract intel anymore. That's not the point. You know that, don't you? He gave a sad smile. They're trying to see if what Hesperus made can ever truly be broken. Navarro still said nothing, but her fists clenched beneath the table. He was right. The interrogations had shifted, less about questions, more about exposure, about unraveling the design. Not to win a war, to study her, dissect her. They don't want your secrets, Ryan said. They want your architecture, your method. They think if they take you apart carefully enough, they can rebuild you, control you. He paused. Or build others like you. Navarro's gaze locked with his then, finally, and the weight in her eyes was enough to make him flinch. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was something else, something that tasted like betrayal and scorched earth. He exhaled. I left the program. Thought I could forget it, but I can't. His voice lowered. They don't know what they created. You were never meant to be a weapon. You were meant to be a test, and you passed, too well. For the first time in what felt like weeks, Navarro spoke. Her voice was dry, cracked at the edges. Then why are you here? Ryan looked ashamed. Because I want to help, and because I owe you. He pulled out a file, thin, yellowed. Her name typed in bold on the front. Not the name she used now, but the one she had before the program. Before she was null. You were supposed to die in the third trial, Ryan said, sliding the file across the table. But you didn't. And I lobbied to keep you alive. They wanted to erase the subject. But I saw something else, something that terrified me. Navarro's hand hovered over the file, but didn't touch it. What did you see? She asked. He hesitated, then answered, I saw someone who couldn't be unmade. She didn't flinch, didn't move. But something shifted in the air, like the heat off scorched asphalt. Power reawakened, the kind that couldn't be contained in manila folders or surveillance rooms. Ryan nodded, as if confirming something to himself. They're moving you tomorrow, he said, deeper into the facility. More invasive tests, more surgical methods. His voice faltered. If you're going to do something, it has to be tonight. Navarro stared at the file, then at him. Why tell me this? Ryan's eyes met hers, stripped of the clinical calm he'd worn like armor. Because I've spent years helping build prisons, but you're the only one who ever escaped before you were even free. And if there's a way to end what they started, it begins with you. He stood up, slowly, and left the room. The camera in the corner blinked red. Navarro reached forward, finally, and opened the file. Inside were photographs, transcripts, classified details of her training, and something else, a blueprint, not of the building, of her cell, a map etched in silence, a gift from the man who once watched her become unbreakable. And in the silence that followed, Navarro smiled.
Navarro had always known that silence was never just the absence of sound. It was a space, a weapon, and sometimes a signal for war. She had spent weeks inside the facility without seeing natural light, without hearing another human voice that didn't echo from behind a speaker or reverberate through a torturer's grin. But now, as she sat in the isolation chamber, codenamed White Echo, the silence she had once been forced to endure became the very thing she used to dismantle their control. The technicians thought they had removed all auditory stimulation. They were wrong. Navarro had trained for this. Trained in deserts where cicadas shrieked through bone-dry canyons, in bunkers where instructors blasted sirens for 72 hours without pause. She'd learned how to measure time by breath and heartbeat, to track movement through vibration, to map architecture through echoes of her own whispered words. They thought silence would drive her mad, but instead, it revealed to her the rhythm of the facility. Every shift change, every malfunction in the aging circuitry, every half-second delay between camera sweeps. She became attuned to it all. It began with her posture. While they thought she curled into a fetal ball from stress, she was actually pressing her ear against the floor to trace movement. Her fingers tapped coded rhythms into the steel beneath her, sending messages only she could understand. Morse, sure, but also older methods. Russian tap code, resonance timing from South American cells, even encoded breathing cycles, once used in Cold War submarines. Her captors observed her with detached amusement, assuming this was the onset of mental collapse. They had no idea they were being watched right back. Then came the auditory hallucinations. Expected, even welcomed. But Navarro didn't fight them. She shaped them. A voice here, a hum there. She started imagining enemy voices, saying absurd things, just to practice rerouting her stress responses. Sometimes she forced herself to believe she heard her mother's lullaby in the distant vents. Other times she recreated field recordings of interrogation survivors from her training archives. She let the voices wash over her, not to comfort her, but to sharpen her. To inoculate herself against the synthetic sound warfare they would inevitably bring again. On the 6th day of silence, she began constructing what she called the mirror. It wasn't an object, but a psychological weapon, a mental reflection of everything they used against her. She took their phrases, their tactics, their manipulation routines, and played them back to herself with just enough distortion that she could twist them. So when they finally reintroduced sound, first with low-frequency vibrations meant to disturb her equilibrium, Navarro smiled. She had been waiting. The moment the vibrations entered the floor, she timed her breath. She synced her pulse. She turned their weapon into rhythm, turned rhythm into calm. Dr. Vilas, now observing her closely, noted the absence of expected psychological breakdown. No pacing, no scratching. No sign of auditory panic, he wrote in his report. Subject appears still. Still. That was the word they feared. Stillness, to people like Navarro, meant preparation. On the 7th day, the chamber's silence broke without warning. A cacophony of overlapping voices flooded the room. Screams, crying children, distorted audio from war zones, even dog barks looped into a maddening rhythm. Any average subject would have folded in minutes. But Navarro didn't move. She'd already built resistance to each of those sound files before. In fact, she'd cataloged them. She recognized the specific pitch of a Sarajevo blast used in the background loop. She heard the same orphan chant used in North Korean conditioning experiments. Her training had involved decrypting trauma through noise, learning that pain could be categorized, neutralized, and, if necessary, weaponized. They thought they were disorienting her, but she was dissecting them. And then she began to hum. Not a melody, but a single, unwavering frequency. Her captors didn't recognize it. But Vilas did. His face paled as he watched her on the screen. It was a field signal used by covert anti-interrogation units during capture, a distress tone that only operatives from her Black Ops lineage would know. Navarro wasn't humming out of madness. She was transmitting. And worse, she was letting them know she knew that they were listening. White Echo was supposed to be a black hole of the senses, yet she had turned it into a speaker. That night, the team switched off the audio barrage. They went back to silence, hoping to reset her responses. But they didn't know she had already advanced to another layer of control. Navarro began to manipulate the oxygen in her cell by timing her breathing with the cycling vents, creating miniature pressure shifts to redirect airflow toward the surveillance mics. The mics, cheap and overused, began to record faint signals, not her voice, but a strange pattern of static. One of the junior techs flagged it, confused. It wasn't noise. It was data, encoded, encrypted, in a rhythm that resembled pulse transmission. "What the hell is she doing?" the tech asked. "She's communicating," Vilas whispered, his voice barely audible, "to someone who's listening." The moment Navarro stepped into the white room, she knew it was no ordinary interrogation cell. The air was different, thinner, colder, and painfully dry, as if designed to parch the very breath from your lungs. The room was smooth and seamless, with no visible corners, door frames, or vents. Everything was white. Not sterile white, but blinding, aggressive, disorienting white. The lights above her buzzed with a tone that seemed to drill into her skull, steady and unnatural. And when she turned back, there was no door behind her, no exit. Just 4 glowing walls and a mirrored floor that reflected her image from below like a ghost. There were no guards, no table, no chair, not even the pretense of civility. She had been placed in a vacuum of humanity, no stimuli, no sound beyond her own heartbeat, no direction to face, no clues about who was watching. But Navarro recognized the method instantly. This wasn't about getting answers. This was about erasing them. This room was engineered to fragment identity, to fracture the sense of time, place, and self. It was isolation as a scalpel, cutting not just into the body, but the mind. Navarro took a slow breath, deliberately lowering herself into a cross-legged position on the floor, her palms resting gently on her knees. She didn't panic. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She simply closed her eyes. If they wanted her to lose orientation, she would respond by becoming the axis. If they wanted to disorient her, she would make herself the only constant. She slowed her breathing, drew it in through her nose, out through her mouth. 4 seconds in. 4 seconds out. A rhythm of survival learned long ago, not in a government briefing room, but in a muddy prison pit, where names and voices had long since decayed. Karamak hadn't taught her to endure pain. It had taught her to master herself when pain made everything else chaotic. Behind the walls, hidden from sight, a debate was unfolding. "She's not responding to the destabilization cues," a tense female voice snapped through a headset. "Look at her vitals. She's adapting." Another voice chimed in, more neutral but intrigued. "That breathing, it's rhythmic, meditative. She's building internal structure in the absence of external ones. She's repurposing the environment into something she can control." Colonel Breck's voice growled above them all. "Increased thermal flux. We'll see if meditation holds up under whiplash." Suddenly the room's temperature shifted violently. One moment Navarro's skin burned with suffocating heat, as though she had been dropped in the desert. The next, she was plunged into an Arctic chill that seemed to pierce straight through her bones. Sweat froze on her skin, her lungs tensed, muscles locked. The shifts came in faster intervals, slamming her body with alternating signals. Sweat, then shiver, then breathless, then fire. But still she didn't move. Her eyes remained closed, her spine straightened. Her breath never lost rhythm. Pain was acknowledged, but not obeyed. Navarro knew the trick wasn't to resist the storm. It was to become the eye within it. She felt every temperature change. She let each one pass through her, then placed it in an imaginary box, labeled and contained, locked away in a corner of her mind that they couldn't touch. She wasn't ignoring the discomfort. She was mastering it, shrinking it down into irrelevance. Pain was no longer her enemy. It was a message, and messages could be controlled. Brecht slammed his hand down as her cortisol levels remained almost flat. "She's suppressing her biological response." The psychologist next to him whispered, "It's not suppression. It's precision." Brecht snarled, "No one has that kind of precision." "You're wrong," she said softly. "She does." Hours passed. First 1, then 3, then 6. The room transformed again. The light above shut off, leaving Navarro in complete darkness. Not a shadowed corner or a dim glow, but total black, so consuming that even her own hands became invisible to her. Silence fell like a second skin. No hum, no movement. Not even her own breath echoed. Her heartbeat was the only sound, and even that she controlled. She slowed it, just slightly, and folded deeper into herself. She wasn't afraid of the dark. She had been raised in it. She had been forgotten in it. Darkness wasn't an absence to her. It was a signal. It meant they were afraid of what light might show her. As the hours wore on, strange sensory cues were introduced. Barely perceptible sounds that could have been footsteps or memories. Bursts of warmth, followed by the scent of smoke. A sudden metallic taste on her tongue, then the smell of antiseptic. Each stimulus was brief and untraceable, meant to dislodge her sense of control. Navarro did not flinch. These were the tactics of people who thought minds could be bent with enough pressure, but they had never met someone whose mind had already been shattered and reforged into a weapon. She was not a mirror. She was a blade. When a soft, synthetic voice finally echoed through the room, "Navarro, are you ready to talk?" It met silence. Not resistance, not defiance, but the kind of silence that swallows questions whole and never returns them. She did not nod, did not answer, did not blink. Her stillness was louder than any rebellion. It was a warning. They had taken away sound, light, time, and even temperature. But she remained. Not because she endured, but because she had already survived worse. And in the center of that featureless room, with no door and no escape, Navarro was not a prisoner. She was the only thing they could not unmake. Inez Navarro had endured everything a human body could legally and illegally survive. Electric shocks that curled her spine until it felt like glass. Dehydration so intense her organs screamed. Chemical disorientation that blurred the lines between reality and hallucination. But nothing. Compared to the silence chamber, it wasn't the absence of noise that nearly broke her. It was the absence of self. The chamber stripped away sound, time, even gravity. It turned thoughts into avalanches, unraveling one's identity thread by thread. But Navarro didn't break. She adapted. She mapped the silence like terrain, timed the clicks and whirs behind the walls, and deciphered the pattern behind the chaos. In silence, others heard madness. She heard code. When they finally opened the chamber for what they expected to be the last time, they didn't find a broken woman begging for mercy. They found stillness, composure, eyes that stared back with calculation. One of the men in a black operations uniform, thick-necked and smug, leaned in with a steel baton in one hand, testing her with the same tired expression he'd worn on day one. "You think this is over?" he said, close enough that she could smell stale nicotine on his breath. "You don't know how deep this program goes." Inez didn't respond. She didn't have to. Her silence now wasn't surrender, it was strategy. She studied the twitch in his jaw, the way his feet were just slightly staggered for balance, the precise spot on his thigh where the baton rested carelessly. He was trained but not combat-tested, and his arrogance was camouflage for fear. What he didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that Navarro had already escaped, mentally, emotionally, strategically. She had counted every step from her chamber to the control room, measured the air cycles between shift rotations, memorized the pattern of every hallway, camera angle and access point. Pain wasn't the enemy, it was the map, and she'd followed it right to this moment. The restraints on her wrists had been loosened slowly, over time. Each day she had subtly flexed and twisted until the leather stretched just enough. They stopped checking. That was their first mistake. The second was leaning too close. With one explosive pivot, Inez drove her elbow into the man's throat, seized the baton as he choked, and spun behind him in a fluid, silent motion. Before the other guards even registered movement, she shattered his knee with a downward strike that echoed like a firecracker in the confined space. He collapsed, screaming, but she was already on the next man. She dodged a punch, twisted his wrist until bone cracked, and used his fall to block the third's line of sight. Then she disappeared into the corridor like a ghost. Alarms blared, red lights flashing across sterile white walls. The complex lit up like a wasp nest kicked awake. But Navarro wasn't panicking. She moved with purpose, her bare feet silent on the cold tile. The pain in her ribs and shoulder was a background hum. Her mind had trained itself to mute it. Ahead was the security wing. The biometric door was locked with high-clearance access. She dragged the first interrogator's limp body behind her, fingers numb but firm as she pressed his hand against the reader. The lock disengaged with a soft click. She slipped through before the backup alarms caught up. Inside was the command hub, a brain of screens and servers humming with secrets. Navarro moved fast. She'd seen the layout during her earlier transports. She knew which terminal had access to the internal logs and evidence drives. She powered it on, fingers flying across the keyboard. For a former field linguist turned interrogation specialist, data systems weren't a challenge. She cracked the encryption in under a minute. A decade of classified footage. Transcripts. Names. Torture logs. Personnel records. Passwords. Locations. Schedules. The entire illegal black site operation laid bare on her screen. She inserted the encrypted flash drive hidden in her makeshift bandage wrap and began the transfer. Outside the room, footsteps thundered, this time heavier. These weren't guards. These were soldiers. Containment mode had been triggered. Lethal force authorized. She scanned the screen. 80%. 90. A distant voice barked orders. She heard a rifle being cocked. The door wouldn't hold much longer. Download complete. She yanked the drive, shoved it into her waistband, and bolted toward the ventilation shaft she'd marked days ago. The screws on the grate had been loosened during one of her staged outbursts. It fell away with a clang. She climbed quickly, the tight shaft slicing into her bruised arms, her lungs burning. Below her, the door was breached. Boots stormed in. Gunfire echoed through the chamber, too late. For 5 minutes, she crawled upward, navigating vents filled with dust and heat until she emerged into a forgotten maintenance tunnel that led above ground. There, behind rusted fencing and barbed wire, lay the world she had once been taken from. When she finally reached the surface, her hands scraped and bleeding, her hospital gown soaked with sweat and dried blood, she collapsed into the snow. But she didn't feel cold. She felt clarity. The sun touched her face for the first time in 37 days, and it didn't blind her. It baptized her. She stood, alone, free, and with the proof that would tear their empire apart. She didn't just escape. She returned, with every weapon they thought they'd destroyed. When the blast doors groaned open, what met Navarro wasn't the resistance she had been trained to expect. No counterforce, no automatic fire. Just a silence so unnatural it sent a chill down her spine. Inside the command center, the air was stale, with the scent of burned circuitry and scorched betrayal. The overhead lights flickered weakly, casting jagged shadows over what remained, a massacre in slow motion. Control terminals lay split open like broken ribs, their digital guts hanging out. Chairs were overturned, smeared with streaks of blood. The far wall, once covered with giant surveillance monitors, had collapsed inward, smoke still rising from a detonation that hadn't just destroyed hardware, it had erased truth. Navarro moved carefully, each footstep crunching over glass and fractured wires. Her body still ached from the torture chamber, but her mind was electric, sharp, focused, running years ahead of what they'd expected. They hadn't just underestimated her will. They'd failed to grasp that the very system they built had trained her to turn pain into pattern. The woman who now walked into their sanctum was not a victim. She was their finest failure. She found it on a metal table bolted to the floor, a thick black folder sealed with a red ribbon and tagged with a name, Subject Echo 9, her name. She opened it slowly, hand trembling not with fear, but fury. Pages flipped past. Obsessive documentation of her every movement, every reaction to pain, every defiant word muttered in isolation. There were graphs of her neural responses, annotations about her resistance thresholds, behavioral notes detailing when she cried, when she stopped, and when she started humming through torture like a lullaby to herself. But the last page struck harder than any previous line. It wasn't a chart or a note, it was a prediction. Subject Echo 9 is unlikely to be controllable. Containment required. Termination preferred. That had been their plan all along. She almost missed the second document, slid beneath the folder like a concealed weapon. It was a map, not just of this facility, but of dozens more, scattered across continents. Some underground, some disguised as humanitarian compounds, some floating at sea. They all shared the same iconography, a lightning bolt over a human ear. The symbol of the Sonic Manipulation Division, Navarro's division. These weren't isolated incidents. They were systematic. What had happened to her had happened to others. What she survived, others hadn't. Footsteps echoed behind her. Vilas limped into the room, blood running down his cheek, one arm hanging limp at his side. "It's done," he panted. "We took out the signal core. They tried to reroute control to the satellite uplink, but it collapsed. Firewall's gone. Uplinks fried. They're blind." Navarro nodded. She didn't speak. Instead, she folded the map with deliberate precision and slid it into her vest. When she finally met Vilas's eyes, her expression was harder than steel. "This was never about one prison," she said. "This was a blueprint. Outside, dawn had broken, casting harsh orange light through the compound's blasted entrance. Wind swept through the corridors, lifting ash and papers into ghostly spirals. Navarro stepped through the wreckage like she was walking into history. Helicopters circled overhead. Not military, not rescue, but something else. Corporate birds. Black and unmarked. Watching. Waiting. She knew what they were thinking. If Echo 9 survived, what else had they miscalculated? She wasn't a rogue agent anymore. She was a liability, a narrative they couldn't control. The world would never hear about this place. The explosion would be blamed on a training accident, the missing personnel scrubbed from records, the test subjects listed as deceased or mentally unfit. But Navarro had taken the only thing they couldn't destroy, the truth. It lived now in her mind, in the map, in her rage. And if they wanted silence, they would face something worse. Her voice. At the edge of the runway, a convoy of escape vehicles waited. Survivors from other sections of the compound, dazed, injured, and afraid. Some were test subjects who had clawed their way free. Others were whistleblowers who realized, too late, that loyalty didn't guarantee survival. Navarro walked past them silently, the weight of their stares heavy on her back. She wasn't a symbol to them. She was a question mark. What happens when the machine fails to kill what it creates? She didn't stop until she reached the end of the tarmac, where the desert stretched out like a scorched promise. The wind carried the faint sound of sirens in the distance. Response teams. Cleanup crews. But they were too late. The damage had already metastasized. Navarro looked down at the folder in her hands. She whispered the name they had given her like a curse. Echo 9. But that wasn't her name. Not anymore. That was the name of the prisoner. The experiment. The woman who had been chained to a slab and turned into a lab rat. She dropped the folder to the ground and let the wind scatter it like ashes. "I know who I am now," she murmured, "and it's not yours to define." The others slowly gathered behind her, forming a loose circle in the dust. Survivors. Fighters. Wreckage that still breathed. No one spoke. They didn't need to. They were already connected. By pain, by rage, by the fire that refused to go out. Navarro looked at them all, then back at the horizon. "This doesn't end here," she said. "We find the others, we burn the rest, and we make damn sure the next Echo never has to scream." The wind howled, the ground smoked, and Navarro, no longer a test subject but the storm itself, walked into the future. The compound was collapsing. Not in fire or rubble, but in silence. The moment Navarro stepped into the communications center, a hush had fallen. Dozens of operatives, agents, analysts, all trained, all ruthless, stared at her as if seeing a ghost that remembered everything. Because she did. Every scream, every test, every attempt to erase her. She had carried those frequencies in her bones, those coded tortures, embedded in neural rhythms. But now, she controlled the signal. Dr. Velas wasn't present. He had fled hours before the system breach, a coward who knew exactly what Navarro was capable of. The last surveillance logs showed him boarding a black helicopter that never cleared the coast. Navarro hadn't needed to lift a finger. The code had spoken for her, and the code did not forget. She approached the central console, where two technicians stood frozen. One tried to speak, but the other gently nudged him aside, eyes wide with recognition. They parted. Navarro slid into the operator's chair, once reserved for the architect of her torment, and placed the small receiver she had worn under her skin onto the biometric pad. The lights in the room dimmed. A pulse rippled across every monitor. Green waves spiked into blue, the system recalibrating to her neural blueprint. Navarro tapped a key. A map of the globe expanded, revealing dozens of red nodes. Other black sites, listening stations, deep-sea research cells. The reach of the program extended far beyond this base. But not for long. She uploaded a sequence embedded within her body's movements, an engram formed through torture, resistance, and retention. She had memorized it while being broken, reassembled it while pretending to be mute. Now it became a virus,
Not one meant to destroy, but to expose. Screens began flashing. Medical logs, recordings, psychological profiles, interrogation files, all marked as classified by the highest echelons of the government. Navarro had always known this wasn't just a rogue lab. This was a sanctioned operation, hidden beneath layers of patriotic rhetoric. Within minutes, secure lines began ringing. She didn't answer any of them. Navarro stood and stepped away from the console. Others could fight the political war. Her battle was over the moment she made her pain louder than their control. She walked through the compound as its power flickered and alarms blared, not as a fugitive, but as a signal no one could silence. She entered the lower detention wing, where the others, like her, were kept. The guards had abandoned their posts. Some of the prisoners were still sedated, others trembling in confusion. Navarro unlocked every door. She didn't speak. Her presence said everything. They followed her like shadows being reattached to the light. Outside, the sky was beginning to pale with dawn. Navarro stepped into the open air, no longer flinching from wind or sudden noise. The world, even at its most chaotic, would never be as loud as what they did to her. A convoy of military vehicles rumbled in the distance. Too late. She had transmitted everything. A news station in Istanbul already reported it. A flash drive had already arrived at the UN. A former interrogator had already defected to testify. They couldn't stop the spread of truth, not when the signal had come from inside their own silence. Navarro walked into the forest, leaving behind the cage that failed to contain her. She would not be hunted. She would not be studied. She would be remembered, not as an experiment, but as the woman who turned torture into testimony. And somewhere, beyond the reach of their satellites, a new frequency began to pulse. It didn't scream. It didn't beg. It endured. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.